Barron, the director of the Middle East and Middle East American Center. And I'm so pleased that you're all joining me today. I would like to thank Jeremy Randall, the assistant director of the center, for all the work he's done on the organizing the Egypt Salon. I would like to thank Tamara for her graphic work on the posters that we've sent out. And I'd like to thank our partners, and Tarek Sadawi at the Alliance for the Egyptians in North America. So he's going to say a few words and then I'll introduce the speakers.
There is a website for this conference, this series, and thanks to Professor Barron, because she agreed we'll run it for a whole year, and every month we'll make one specific topic, but whatever. So if you have inputs, definitely Professor Barron or myself, we can accept input for speakers. Again, we all know that the Middle East is unstable, so definitely it is a good time to address those type of issues.
We have a special guest today. His name is Dr. Sahar Aziz. I'm so pleased that some of us are still standing after the Middle East Studies Association meeting a week ago, where I saw her, had a meeting with her, a quick one as well. So Dr. Aziz is professor of law, the chancellor, social justice scholar, and Middle East and legal studies scholar at Rutgers University Law School. She is the founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and a faculty affiliate of the African American Studies Department at Rutgers University, Newark, as well as an editor for the Arab Law Quarterly. So please join me in welcoming her, and she's going to be speaking on U.S. foreign policy in Egypt. Thank you.
You know who the true believers are when you plan an event on a Friday evening. So you are the true believers, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedules. So I'll tell you a little bit about the center that I founded to give you some context of what I'm going to talk about today. So as you all know, what happens in the Middle East affects what happens in the United States, and arguably what we do here affects them there. And I'll talk a little bit more about this relationship between U.S. foreign policy and Egypt foreign and domestic policy. But the Center for Security, Race, and Rights aims to connect those dots so that we can understand why the diaspora and how they're treated here, and what's the relationship between what's happening in the Middle East, and then to some extent hopefully empower those communities to be engaged in lobbying our government here on issues that are based on our values. Because if there's one thing we've learned, at least for example from the Arab-Israeli conflict, is that the diaspora that's here that is in support of Israel has been very effective and very influential in affecting U.S. foreign policy in Israel, and I don't think there's any reason why Egyptian Americans or Arab Americans can't do the same on Egypt or other Middle East countries. And as we all know, the states are certainly lobbying very heavily. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, they're certainly lobbying. So there's no reason why we as citizens can't influence our government as well. Okay.
The mic maybe will be
Right here? You can or you cannot?
I can.
Okay, all right. Okay, so there's 3 takeaways that I'd like you to consider based on my talk. The first is that national security trumps, no pun intended, human rights in U.S. foreign policy with Egypt. And that's irrespective of the administration's party affiliation. This is something that has been consistent across administrations, Republican or Democratic, maybe some variation in degrees, arguably with Obama, but generally speaking, the national security card is a very powerful one that whoever rules Egypt or many Middle Eastern countries uses frequently to sidestep or dismiss any types of human rights violations that are occurring domestically. The second, which is interesting development, I think, is that both the U.S. and Egypt are starting to rely less on each other. The relationship is becoming more diffuse, partly because of the changes in the power dynamics in the region, where Egypt is losing its hegemonic influence and Saudi Arabia is filling that position, and the Arab Emirates is also, not because they're big, but because they're rich and very active. and also vis-a-vis Iran, Saudi Arabia has become the champion that's anti-Iranian. So that's also causing Egypt to, as the U.S. becomes less reliable, because, and I'll go a little bit, I'm going to focus a lot on U.S. foreign aid, because that's really what defines the relationship between the two countries. But every time the U.S. holds up aid, it ultimately always gives it. But as we'll say in Arabic, I think the Egyptians, particularly Sisi, is starting to say, okay, fine, I'm going to find alternative sources of military aid, because that's really the underpinning of the relationship, is this military aid, this 1.3 billion a year. So we saw Egypt going to France and getting military equipment, and also relying on Russia, which has caused the Trump administration to threaten sanctions as a result of that. And then that very strange North Korean engagement. So the third one is that chronic and severe human rights violations, especially in Egyptian prisons, which hasn't been getting a lot of attention, but it's important because there's an estimate of 60,000 people in prison right now from various political backdrops, is setting the foundation for long-term instability in the country. And I think in many of the countries where we have this same dynamic, where everybody's just being hauled off to prisons under the guise of whether you're going to call them Ikhwan Muslimin or jihadis or any enemy of the state. And the stories that I've been reading from people who do get out, usually it's the secular activists, are troubling. And they're saying, no, they are similar to what we saw in Iraq, which ultimately became Daesh. Many of the people that were in jail in Iraq ultimately were joining Daesh and building it up. However, I'm not sure if the United States cares anymore. So, I think that this pivot towards Asia and towards China is going to change the relationship and the role of the Middle East, and that's still in flux. And we don't really know if the Middle East is going to be a buffer, which I think is more likely, but China will be the enemy, as opposed to the Middle East being the frenemy, but it certainly helps the U.S. defense industry for there to be war. And that's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, if you make money by selling weapons and there's no war, then there's no need for weapons. And that might not necessarily be a U.S. government policy, but the defense industry is a very strong stakeholder in the U.S. economy, has very strong ties, and the U.S. is already undergoing its own privatization of politics in all of the special interest groups. So we shouldn't underestimate that. Okay, so what are the U.S. national security interests in Egypt? Many of you are familiar with these, kind of this long list array of factors. And I don't want to say that nothing happened before 1979, but the current paradigm and the current model relationship is centered around the 1979 Egypt-Israeli peace treaty. And we all know Egypt was the first to make peace with Israel, and that was, of course, Sadat arguably got assassinated over that. But at that time, that was a very radical and make peace, and the Jordanians who are normalizing, even openly or secretly, relations with Israel. So that trend it's no longer radical to have a peace treaty. But as a result, they were the second largest recipient of foreign aid after Israel, and they continue to be. Although Jordan is catching up. So I think Jordan is over $1 billion a year right now. So it's making a comeback, and I think a lot of it has to do with this normalization of relations with Israel as well. So much of this aid is tied to the relationship between that Middle Eastern country and the Israeli government. So you also have the demilitarized border and the multinational force and observers. The U.S. sends somewhere between 400 to 600 personnel every year, in addition to under the United Nations, in addition to other countries sending their soldiers. But this is a way in which they're constantly collaborating to demilitarize the zone that goes between the border of Egypt and Israel. And of course, the Egyptians are tasked with securing the Gaza border and have always been very active in policing and securitizing it and profiting from the tunnels. I mean, it's no secret that whether it's illegal trade or legal trade. I mean, a lot of it was consumer items that was going under the tunnels between Rafah and Gaza. There were a lot of middlemen, and some of many of those middlemen were government, were police or military or security forces, and this dates back to decades. Right, this is not a new development. It's unclear right now because there's a media blackout in Sinai, so we don't really know what's going on. With the tunnels, they're probably still there because the demand is so high. It's just made goods probably more expensive because you have 2 million people who need to live, and if Israel doesn't let things through the border, they'll get it, from the Egyptian side, and it just becomes more lucrative. Counterterrorism in Sinai in the Middle East is also something that ties the two countries, and right now Sinai continues to suffer from terrorism and instability. The Daesh branch of Sinai seems to be quite successful in eluding the Egyptian military, and it's somewhat of a mystery of why the military can't seem to quash these militants, but it has been used as a basis, and I'll talk a little bit more how, of continuing to get that aid from the U.S. Oh, we've got all this terrorism in Sinai. We've got to stop it, because if we don't stop it, it could grow, it could expand. So a lot of this fear-mongering is very, very common. I don't know how many of you know that Egypt was one of the secret extraordinary rendition sites during George Bush's so-called War on Terror. This is where we sent people that were abducted and kidnapped from Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world, and the CIA sent them there to be tortured, knowing full well they would be tortured, and what they did is they outsourced the torture, so that then if they ever got prosecuted, they could say, we didn't do it, right? It was the foreign actors that did it. But Egypt was one of those sites, and that was something that certainly made Egypt even more important for the global war on terror at that time. Intelligence sharing is very important, obviously the Suez Canal, and then allowing airspace, allowing access to airspace. So it is geographically still a strategic location. Okay, so this is really where the Egyptian government gets very upset if this is sacrificed. I mean, if there's one way you want to know how to get on their enemy list and their blacklist, is advocate in a way that could sacrifice U.S. foreign aid. Everything else, I think, is tangential. But if it can affect this, if you're in the U.S., they get very upset. So $83 billion from 1946 to 2018, that's not adjusted for inflation. That's from the Congressional Research Center. And on average, 1.4 billion per year. There's been some years that it was 1.5 billion, sometimes 1.3 billion. But that's a lot of money, especially for a low income that's become somewhat of a middle income country, and I think it's going back to being a low income country. Now, one thing that's interesting is that economic aid has been reduced by 90%. So it used to be that this 1.4 billion was about 50-50, sometimes even 60-40. In terms of more economic aid than military aid. So for example, in fiscal year 1998, 833 million of the aid package was economic aid. So essentially subsidization of the economy to help the poor. But by fiscal year 2019, it was 75 million. And military aid is now up to 1.3 billion. So most of the money is now going strictly to the military, and very little is going to economic development. Now, some people in Egypt may say, well, I don't really care, because many Egyptians were convinced the money was being stolen anyway, and was lining the pockets of Egyptian government officials, and they saw it as a form of corruption. But even if there is some layer of corruption, it was doing some good. The economic aid was, even if a certain percentage of it was contributing to the economy. But my point is that now the relationship is purely a militarized relationship in terms of foreign aid. The little economic aid that there is primarily through U.S. managed programs, USAID, public health, education, economic development, democracy and governance. Of course, the democracy and governance is pretty much zero at this point. And then something called the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. And I don't know how many of you all are familiar with this fund, but this is an extension of the U.S.'s neoliberal model for development, which is the way that we help developing countries is we make them privatize everything, and it's all about the free markets, and it's peddling that neoliberal agenda. So in 2013, so right after, this is about 2 years after the failed revolution of 2011, the U.S. committed up to 300 million, which is not very much, total 300 million, when they're giving 1.3 billion a year to the military. So it's not very much, but it's to the private sector of Egypt. And effectively, it's spent on technical support to various business sectors based on the host country's individuals. So this is a model they've used in other countries, and it is managed by private independent entities, by a board of directors. So it's effectively business elites who control it. And these are the results. So you judge for yourself if you think this is something that's been effective in helping the Egyptian economy. But as of 2018, they've invested $113 million in 5 companies. That's not very many companies. And then another 20 million in 3 different funds, which have invested in more than 40 businesses across a wide industry spectrum, bringing the total investment of 133, so a little bit less than the total 300 million. And voila, they've created 2,200 jobs in a country that has a 28 million person labor force. So I think the numbers speak for themselves as to whether this Egyptian American Enterprise Fund is impactful or not, and whether it's a good use of our money, our taxpayer money. And as we know, the way things work in Egypt, there's a lot of wasta, there's a lot of connections. So who knows who are these 5 companies and the 40 businesses and the jobs that are created, because if the system is still rigged, it's not addressing underlying social problems or the high unemployment rate, especially among the youth. Okay, now going to what really matters, because again, the economic aid is just for public relations. It's a little sprinkling to appease the masses in the U.S. So it comes through foreign military financing. That's the program. It's administered by the Department of State. Sorry, it's supposed to be singular. And implemented by the U.S. Department of Defense. So the Department of State is who decides whether it's how much the money will be, whether the conditions have been met, whether a waiver applies. And once they agree to that, then the Department of Defense implements it. And all of the money, not surprisingly, must be spent on weapon systems by U.S. defense contractors. So all it is just taking 1.3 billion and giving it to the U.S. defense industry to sell equipment, services to Egypt and many other countries. Same thing with Israel and Jordan and all that. So it's essentially a subsidization. It's a subsidization of the U.S. defense industry, and at the same time providing military aid to authoritarian regimes. And there's also the training of Egyptian military personnel, and we know there's a long tradition of that, which is a strategic move by the United States, because when you sell your weapons, then you know how their weapons work. You control if there's any upgrades. You control the raw materials. So it is in the U.S.'s interest for a country to use its weaponry. There's a lot of control that comes with that, and you already have intelligence of their capabilities because you build those weapons. Similarly, with the training of the military personnel, and we know, for example, there's been a lot of news coverage about Sisi and how when he came here and he did his training and he wrote a report about democracy and Islam, and this was all public. So this is a very common path, and it's a form of cultural indoctrination, right? So this is soft power, and that also comes from the military aid. There are also there's 2 ways that the money is dispersed. There's something called the early dispersal and interest-bearing account, and this is a way to increase. So if you have the 1.3 billion, what many of these countries advocate for is, well, as soon as Congress appropriates the fund, can you put it in an interest-bearing account so that all the interest then increases it maybe from 1.3 to 1.4. Now, it all still has to be spent on military aid or military weapons of the training, but it's very strategic that you can increase it. And so the authorization to do that is important because it can come down to 50 million, 100 million extra dollars. And then all FMF funds, because there's Sometimes when something gets held up because of human rights issues, which I'll talk about in a minute, the money sits there in the FMF fund, but it accrues interest. Right? So that's one way to get more money. The other way that the U.S. provides military aid, not just to Egypt, again to all the countries that receive it, is it gives its outdated equipment to its allies for a reduced rate or for free. So it's like a thrift store. And Egypt is eligible because it's a major non-NATO ally, so under the Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act, it's eligible for this outdated equipment because I'm speculating here, but I suspect that the United States is not going to give its latest technology as part of its foreign aid. Right? That would be risky from a national security perspective. Okay. But there is a problem from the recipient's perspective, which is these pesky human rights conditions that are in the law. And so, for example, in the Appropriation Act of 2012, so every year there's an appropriation for foreign aid, including there's a section on Egypt. And 2012, we all know that's a significant year. That was right after at the time that we thought was a real revolution. And this is under Obama. So Congress said for this aid to be dispersed, the 1.3 billion, the Secretary of State must certify that Egypt is transitioning to a civilian government. And these are the three things that must be certified: that they are holding free and fair elections, they're implementing policies to protect freedom of expression and religion and due process of law, and they're meeting obligations under the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. Now, I think just keep this in mind, because when you think back about that era and that period, right, when you had SCAF that was attempting to sabotage the revolution and kept postponing the elections, postponing the constitutional referendum, this was external pressure on them, right? Because the SCAF wants that military aid because they're the military. And at the same time, the United States, or at least Congress, is saying we need to see some advancement, some progress on this. So, and it worked temporarily. They did have those elections. They didn't like the outcome, but they had them. And I think one thing we have to think about when we think about Egyptian domestic politics is, to what extent was this a factor in forcing the SCAF to have those elections, those parliamentary elections, in January of 2012, when they were trying as much as possible to postpone them, right? I mean, obviously there were domestic factors, but they care a lot about this. However, there are waivers available. If the foreign aid is allocated to counterterrorism, border security, counter-proliferation, and development efforts in the Sinai. And so, of course, if you're the recipient country, what you will do, if you have some smart advisors, is to try to figure out how that money is going to this, right, rather than general security or general military upkeep or anything that's not specific to that. The other, then you also have the Leahy Act, which prohibits U.S. government from using funds. Now, this is really important. I'm going to get a little lawyerly on you, legalese. Assistance to units of foreign security forces where there's credible information implicating that unit in the commission of a gross violation of human rights. And essentially what happens is that the foreign governments try to argue that the unit that engaged in the gross violation of human rights was this very small unit of which the government didn't know. They were rogue. They went rogue. And they try to minimize it because it's much harder to prove that the government was aware that a small unit engaged in human rights violations as opposed to a larger unit in the security forces. And these are definitions of gross violation of human rights. So they're they're gross violations. They're not simply violations of due process in a court of law, but torture, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearance, rape under color of law. And as a result, human rights advocates are very savvy in framing human rights violations as this, because that can trigger the Leahy Act, correct? And also showing that the government knew that these units were engaging in these violations. However, there is an exception if the foreign government is taking corrective steps to bring responsible people to justice. So if you can find a scapegoat in the police, or some lowly police officer or something along those lines, if you had to, that's one way to show, okay, we're remediating, we're taking corrective action. It was a mistake. And then the other exception is for either disaster relief operations, humanitarian emergency, or national security emergency. So Sinai is in a state of emergency, and to the extent that the government could use that for some of the funds, that could be one way to argue, okay, we need, if there's a national security emergency, or if there's going to be a civil war and things are becoming very unstable. But the point is it's available in the law. Okay, so if we go back to 2012, the appropriations law, so the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which is the Leahy Act, this is another condition. So you have the gross human rights, gross violations of human rights, and the second is you have a coup. There is a legal prohibition of the U.S. government giving foreign aid to a country, to a government that came into power through a coup. This is not Egypt specific. And the language of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, so this is a long time ago, during the Cold War, not coincidentally, restrict assistance to the government of any country whose duly elected head of government is deposed by military coup or decree. It was then implemented into 2012's appropriation into Section 708, which essentially repeats that, prohibits assistance to the government of any country whose duly elected head of government is opposed by military coup d'etat or decree, or after the date of enactment, coup d'etat, in which the military plays a decisive role. And that's important because there were all of these debates that June 30th, 2012 was not, or 2013, was not a coup. It was a popular coup, or it was a popularly supported coup, or it was Revolution 2.0. But again, if you can show that the military plays a decisive role, and arguably when it is the military Secretary of Defense who goes in front of the people and says, this democratically elected president is out, and anyway, we talk about that separately. But that put Obama's administration into a tough situation. And remember, at this time, 2013, Daesh is flying high, right? Daesh is growing, ISIS is growing, there's all this hysteria around ISIS, which every Middle Eastern country is exploiting, and his government's trying to figure out, okay, how do we continue to give aid to Egypt and not violate U.S. law? Because then the government could get sued. Well, I know, we just won't make a decision. So what the Secretary of State decided was that as a matter of law, they were not required to determine whether or not it was a coup. They were just going to say no comment. We can't say if it's a coup, and we can't say if it's not a coup, and we don't have to. And as long as we haven't declared it a coup, we haven't violated the law. And that's effectively how Egypt continued to get aid, even if from 2012, from 2013 to 2014, say, well, it was a constitutional court justice, the chief justice who was the president, except that it made it a little bit more difficult when the Secretary of Defense ultimately did run for president. And so at some point it became a little bit harder to show that the military did play a decisive role. And I think we've gotten to the point now where the military is very open in saying we saved Egypt. Right? I mean, the military doesn't hide that in Egypt. They're like, we saved you from chaos and from the terrorists and from. So that game is over in terms of that propaganda game. But at this time, that was a big deal because you had 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion, and you also just have the reputation of the country and the legitimacy of the regime at stake. So since, after 2012, the U.S. has just consistently granted a waiver and boldly saying that continued aid is in the national security of the United States. And all of these human rights laws are just going to have to take a secondary, they're just not important. Now, something happened in 2014, which was interesting, but it only lasted for a year. And this may have been as a result of human rights lobbying and advocacy in the United States. But the appropriations bill, the congressional appropriations bill, removed the Secretary of State's authority to waive the Egypt-specific democratization requirements so that they couldn't issue that waiver. But then it was restored again in 2015, as long as the aid could be shown to be in national security. And then it divided the aid. So when in 2014, for that 1 year, when it removed the waiver and took away the discretion from the State Department, it said, however, we're going to divide it. This is unconditional. So as long as the aid can be shown, it's for existing contracts and security projects related to counterterrorism, border security, non-proliferation, and cyber development, it keeps going. Like, if it's existing, we keep funding it. And then we'll separate the rest of the aid tie it to holding parliamentary and presidential elections, and a newly elected government of Egypt is taking steps to govern democratically. And again, this is about the same time that Sisi's running for president. And he had his elections, right? And he had parliamentary elections, and he amended the Constitution. So technically the boxes were checked. And in any event, it only lasted for a year, and then the waiver came back. Now, interestingly, in 2015, when Kerry has his waiver again, he admits that he cannot certify that Egypt made progress towards democracy, which I'm sure made Sisi very upset. However, he says, Egypt is providing U.S. military preferential passage through the Suez Canal. Egypt is authorizing the U.S. to fly over Egyptian airspace, and Egypt is assisting U.S. in the campaign against ISIS. And therefore, we're going to issue the waiver, and we're going to give them their money. Because human rights are subordinated to national security, as if the two are distinct and separate interests. And this is really a U.S. policy problem. I mean, this is squarely a problem in the United States government and in United States society. And what it reflects is that the American government, to the extent it represents its people, does not believe in human rights. So whatever they're teaching you in school is a lie. And I think it's important, because if we find that to be offensive, right, if we find that to be contrary to what we believe in as citizens, as taxpayers, then we have to tell these representatives that no, you can't do that in our name. I don't care if it's Egypt, I don't care if it's Thailand, I don't care if it's Chile, Venezuela, it doesn't matter. This is not Egypt specific. It's a very Machiavellian way of foreign policy, and it makes a lot of the instability make sense. Because to the extent that you believe human rights there's multiple reasons to support human rights. One is just for moral, ethical reasons as standalone. The other is more utilitarian and pragmatic, where you actually do believe that human rights produces more stability, right? Where human rights actually decreases conflicts. And if you do, then it makes sense why the U.S. is at least not contributing to increasing stability. Okay, so the Trump administration, so everything that I've talked about applies to the Trump administration. It is not unique to Bush, it's not unique to Clinton, it's not unique to Obama. I mean, the only thing that Obama did is he did hold back some of that aid for about 9 or 10 months. And for example, the 2014 withdrawal of the waiver, but he gave in at the end of the day. So it was business as usual. So here's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in January 2019 at the AUC, 10 years after Obama had given his historic speech in Cairo, where he was trying to be unifying, and he was trying to say that Muslims are not our enemies and Arabs are not terrorists, and there is no clash of civilization, and we can work together. And Pompeo said very clearly, Obama was wrong, and the United States has reasserted its traditional role as a force for good in this region. We've learned from our mistakes. And on its face, we know the answer is no, but the mistakes he was referring to was Obama's attempts to try to decrease the securitization, the militarization Obama tried. Rhetorically, he was very effective, but in practice, he wasn't as effective as I think he wanted to be or as we'd hoped he would be. But Pompeo came out and he was very hawkish and said, no, we're supporting the status quo. And then President Trump, just a few months ago, and this is among the many praises that he has lavished on Sisi, says Sisi has done some things that are absolutely amazing in a short period of time. Egypt has a great leader. He's highly respected. He's brought order. Before he was here, there was very little order. There was chaos, and so I'm not worried about that at all. And this was about the same time that the protests were starting in Egypt after the Muhammad Ali videos were coming out, right? And Sisi made sure that he was recorded on television with Trump to send a message to his detractors, whomever they were in the deep state, that I've got the Americans on my side, right? I read that and I thought, wow, he took the script from the Egyptian state media, the SIS. Okay, so this is ultimately what most Egyptians care about, and I think this is what most people who want the best for the people of Egypt and who want stability in that country or any other country. But Egypt's misery index is very high. So that is the annual inflation plus unemployment rate. And many of us who have relatives in Egypt, this is not a secret, that the inflation rate, so this is 2017, about 2 years ago, or a year and a half, 30 to 33%, primarily because of the lifting of the subsidies on food and on gas, and also the floating of the pound in a country that has a very high trade deficit, so high imports, levels of imports, which makes, when you devalue the pound, makes things even more expensive. And a private sector that is actually shrinking as opposed to growing, so that ideally when you devalue your pound, not ideally, it makes domestic products cheaper, right? Except that domestic products in the U.S. and Egypt are so highly dependent on foreign imports of raw materials. So it wasn't creating a demand for domestic products, it was just creating more inflation. Food prices were rising at 39%. I think food usually is between 60 to 80% of a family's budget, depending on their wealth. But imagine that your salary, you spend 60 to 80% just eating, just to eat. For us here, I think it's 10%, 15% at most, and maybe a little higher for lower income people. Unemployment rate 30% for young people, 50% for young women. The official rate is 12.6%, which in itself is high, but I think we understand that. And there's a huge informal sector in Egypt, so it's hard to figure that out. So this is from the New Arab, which I realize is something that tends to be critical of the regime, but take it for what it's worth. This is from 2019 in one of their articles, was just showing the percentage of prices going up. And remember, this is just 1 year. Every year it goes up. So if you compare it from 2011 to 12 to 13, you're getting even higher. So drinking water, 45%, electricity, 26%. Metro fare, it used to be £1, now it's 5 to 8 pounds. And the metro is what most poor Egyptians rely on. And when gas goes up, the microbus fare goes up. Gas went up 50% for 80 octane, 34% for 92. Cooking gas, 66%. So everything has gotten more expensive. Recently, I think just a few weeks ago, the Egyptian government declared that inflation had gone down to, I think, 3% or 4%. To the extent you believe that number, it's based on the past year. So it's good news if it doesn't continue to go at these rates, but it's already gone up so high and the salaries haven't gone up with them. So I think this is probably the weakest point for the regime, and I think that if Sisi wants to stay in power for long, this is what he has to solve. For better or worse, democracy and political freedoms and freedom of expression is something that many Egyptians will say we don't prioritize that. There are memories of the chaos, the high crime rate when the police intentionally withdrew from the streets after 2011. They didn't like that. The protests that were constantly disrupting traffic, constantly disrupting their lives. So there are many Egyptians who support Sisi, not necessarily because they support him, but because they want law and order and they see Sisi, or the military specifically, as the entity that was able to produce that for now. But that's not, at the end of the day, going to be enough if they can't eat. Right? If the healthcare system is in shambles, the education system is in shambles, and all of this is taking just these basic necessities, is also taking out of any disposable income they have, so they can't educate their children. So the middle class is really in crisis because the public school system collapsed decades ago. But what the middle class did is they put their kids in the national public schools, the national private schools, and now that's even too expensive. So the middle class is shrinking. I think the poverty rate is now, the government's official rate is 32%. The people living below poverty, it's 32 million people. That's the official rate. So the real rate is probably around 40 that are living at poverty or below poverty. And at some point it's not stable. So we'll see. I say this hoping that someone from the Egyptian government is listening, because I think that's what they need to prioritize, is the economy, and they need to create jobs. And now the youth all want to leave the country. All the educated youth are trying to get out, and people who aren't educated as well. So the brain drain continues, and many people in this audience are part of that brain drain from the 70s and the 80s. And so now we've peaked back up to the best and the brightest trying to get out of the country in any way that they can. So, this is where we can have a conversation. This is a picture of the protests in September, which many of us in the West were shocked. Because when you have 60,000 people in jail, and you have Trump saying, this guy's fabulous, my favorite dictator, and he's wonderful, you know that it's really high risk. You have to be very desperate. And you have to know that you will die, or you will be tortured if you go out into the street. That's a level of desperation that should make any authoritarian regime be scared. And as we know with Egyptians, with 100 million, it just takes a tipping point, and no one can stop them. When you have 1 million to 2 million to 3 million Egyptians in the street, even if you start shooting, you can't, there's too many of them. And that's the worst fear, is they never want to get to that tipping point. But there will be a point where if you're starving to death, you say, well, I'm going to die anyway, so I guess I'll die with dignity instead of die from starvation. And again, that's what the government should be concerned about. And I mean, I'll just quickly, many of you know about the Muhammad Ali videos, and I don't know where he came from. He claims that he's just this individual person who was an insider who was engaging with the military for 15 years doing business, and then didn't get paid something like £2 million or maybe more. So he's very upset, goes to Spain, and then issues these videos. I have no doubt that even if he was independent in the beginning, that there are probably many parties attempting to reach out to him to co-opt him, because there certainly are many detractors to Sisi. Some of them are state, some of them are non-state entities. But again, I have no idea what that status is. But what does matter is that this was a signal to Sisi that he needs to feed the people. He needs to employ them, he needs to educate them, he needs to give them health care, because it's not sustainable, right? These austerity measures at some point they're just going to get to a breaking point. And he's making the IMF very happy, and all the free market entrepreneurs and free market neoliberals who could care less about the Egyptian people. But at some point, how much is that external support going to be able to hold up any regime, whether it's Sisi or somebody else, when you have 100 million and growing people? And the other thing, which I haven't even talked about, is the water crisis that's imminent because of the dam that Ethiopia is building. And apparently, I don't see the U.S. being very involved in that at this point, although I think they did announce that they were going to bring the parties to the United States to moderate it. But we'll see what the U.S.'s role is in that regard. So I will end there and open it up for questions. And thank you very much. Sure, I'll do it. Anybody have any questions?
The sequence of the money going into it starts with the Treasury, then the State Department, then this principal, right?
Yeah, but Treasury doesn't have any policy role. It's this, yeah, the Congress authorizes it, the monies and the state funds, but it's really State Department that has the authority to say money is released, money is not released, and then the Defense Department implements it to determine, what is the weaponry, when does it get sent, etc.
Another question.
Yeah.
What about the areas of interest for the American government in Egypt? Shall we include the companies of oil, work in oil exploration, for instance, in the Mediterranean? Would they be a part of the why the American government would be interested in the sense that oil companies have a big say in the American government?
I think natural gas probably more.
But there's some companies that are American. I mean, well, oil and natural gas, they're related somehow.
Yeah. This is where I think there's more diversification. I don't think Egypt is like Iraq, where the U.S. has successfully put its monopoly over the development. I think the Egyptian government is probably savvier and able to negotiate. I have no doubt that the energy industry is lobbying, but Egypt isn't. It's not Iraq. It's not Libya. It's not Algeria. It's not Venezuela. It doesn't have that much oil, such that that's what animates the relationship. Right? I think it's a lot more about security and its strategic location and its bordering with Israel that defines the relationship. And not to say that natural gas and oil don't matter, but it's just not where Egypt is 4th, 5th, 6th on the list because of its reserves that just are not that high. The natural gas issue is interesting, which I didn't talk about, which I think is also creating one of the conflicts with Turkey in addition to the Muslim Brotherhood issue. But now that they're discovering all this natural gas in the Mediterranean, you should anticipate a lot of fighting over whose water, who gets to access it, and et cetera. And there's pipes that are being built. And in light of Egypt's economic problems, it has a huge interest in finding more, sources of revenue, which hopefully will be invested back in the country.
To your knowledge, is the rendition program still going on?
To my knowledge, no. Obama declared it ended, and they passed laws to make it illegal, but it was supposed to be illegal.
The second question.
But that doesn't mean that torture doesn't happen in Egyptian jails.
The second question is, what do you think the ambiguity of Obama administration about deposing Morsi was due to?
It just depends on whether you have faith in Obama or not. So if I'm going to be charitable to Obama, and I'm going to assume he's a good faith actor, I think a few things distinguished Obama on Middle East policy. I think the first was that he believed that dictatorship was a recipe for instability. I think he appreciated the misery that dictatorship imposes on any people, right, anywhere in the world. But the Middle East is, there's all these political scientists that say, what happened to the Middle East? Eastern Europe had its second wave of democracy, and there's all this literature about the Middle East exception and what happened. Why hasn't the Middle East experienced its democratic wave in this modern era? And many people thought, that's it, the Arab Spring is it. Finally, versus the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and in Eastern European countries. So I think Obama was a more sophisticated worldly thinker who understood, who had personal relationships and life experiences with people from developing countries. He wasn't just some white male privileged elite whose only circles were Harvard and Yale and Stanford and or the very conservative, church-going political conservative elite. I think that even though, yes, he's a product of Ivy League schools, I think his life experience, his racial identity made him, and his travels made him, I think, more sophisticated. So that's one, in understanding like why dictatorship is not good for the long run. The second is, I don't think he had the same aversion to political Islam. I think that because of his background of being, having a father that's from Kenya and a father who was Muslim who didn't raise him, but he didn't see Islam as this boogeyman. Right? He didn't see, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood in specific or just political parties who were the counterpart to the evangelical parties. I mean, Pence is a Christian Brotherhood. Pence is a leader in the Christian Brotherhood. We have a Christian Brotherhood in the White House, but nobody seems to be worried about that, right? But that's exactly what Pence is and DeVos is, and that's what they are. They're evangelical Christians who believe that religion should define public policy, that religion should define law. That's why abortion should be illegal, because it's a matter of religion. And yet, we don't go around saying creeping Sharia.
But the reportedly 30 million signatures, wasn't that analogous to a record process under American democracy?
The 30 million signatures of...
There is a reported 30 million signatures.
You mean tamarrud? What are you
to depose, to recall Morsi.
To recall Morsi, right.
The 30th of June.
Right, but, well, the democratic way to do it is to have new elections.
Yeah.
Not to have and the problem we have with the Egyptian story, in hindsight, I think at that moment in time, people really thought that the people were leading and the military was just behind the scenes. But I think that facts have come out to show that the Rijal al-Amal, the business elite, were working with the military, working with the security forces. I'm sure the Israelis were involved, because they certainly didn't like the Brotherhood or Morsi being in power. The Saudis weren't happy, the Emiratis weren't happy. There was a lot going on that produced and facilitated the 30 million signatures. That's not to say that there weren't people who were opposed to Morsi, for sure. I think if the election was going to be the very next month, like his term was up and it was time, he would have been gone. No doubt about it. He had lost a lot of popular support. But if we apply that model here, I can guarantee you that we can probably get 30 million signatures to get rid of Trump. And then we can go ask our Secretary of Defense, could you please get rid of this man right now? I'm not waiting until 2018. But you can't do that when you have a democracy. You have to wait, or find some legal mechanism to have, you can impeach him, which is actually, I wrote about that. I said what they should have done is impeach Morsi, except there was a problem that there was no impeachment mechanism in the Constitution of Egypt, which I thought was really bewildering, probably because most of the presidents thought, well, I'm here for life, so there's no such thing as impeachment. But that's what you do when a president engages in what we call high crimes and misdemeanors right here in the U.S. But my point is, so I think one is Obama was not, again, I think he understood that dictatorship was unsustainable and we needed to have democracy, not perfect, but at least transition. I think he didn't feel that, I think he looked at the political Islamists and the Ikhwan as, okay, well, they're probably going to mess up and then we'll get rid of them through the elections. He didn't see them as this huge threat. I don't think he compared them to the Iranian mullahs who would never ever let go, all these stories. And the third is he's a lawyer by training, and he is a civil rights lawyer, and he taught constitutional law. He's African American. His politics are very pro civil rights, particularly with African American communities. And I think he, at least in his mind, took human rights more seriously and realized this is very hypocritical of us. And he had aides who were pretty well educated in terms of understanding the Middle East, in explaining to him that, in a region where you have a high level of militancy with Daesh and Al-Qaeda, and where in a region where religion is such an important part of life and culture and society, whether you're Christian or whether you're a Muslim, I mean, your religion, there's no separation. Right? People, the faith is an important part of their life. It's not because of the state, it's because of the way that they were raised. And I think they were telling him, it's better to have the political Islamists who work in the system, who are out in the open, and defeat them through politics if you don't agree with their views, than to criminalize them, push them underground, and produce these militant groups. So I think that was his thinking. But, and I think that was the White House's thinking. But you know, you've got the Secretary of Defense, you've got State Department, Defense Department, and all of these people, I mean, many of them were raised and educated in a completely different paradigm. And to them, the idea, I mean, they're totally okay with a secular dictator, but an Islamist, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Won't accept it, whether you're secular, or whether you're democratic or authoritarian, or whatever you are. No Islamists, we can't accept that. And so ultimately, and also I think that Egypt is in a neighborhood where the U.S. can't afford to marginalize it, or Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates. The U.S. can't approach Egypt by itself. And the Egyptian government is very sophisticated. The foreign ministry is sophisticated, and the military is sophisticated in knowing how to make a case to say, you need us. You need us, right? So you're going to have to make a decision, because it's, you know, and also the Egyptian military has very strong relations with the Israeli military, and very strong relations with the American military. And so when they go and tell them, this guy's got to go, for whatever reason, those allies are also going to Obama and saying, he's got to go. And Morsi Morsi had the opposite problem.
I have a lot of questions, but I want to ask a fundamental one. The theme of your speech is that national security interests are trumping human rights. And if you look at the history of our country, whether it was in Iran, where we supported the overthrow of the democratically elected president in the 1960s to reinstall Shah in power, look at Chile and the effort or the support of he took his own life, but wanted to be executed, or even Vietnam War, where we supported military governors because not for human rights issues, but for political reasons that we thought made sense. Has the country really ever been able to put human rights to trump? Has the country ever had human rights trump national security interests? And a more basic question I'm asking is, do you think any country that is a country could be able, in this world, in any kind of time, in any civilization, take a position where one would look back and say in history that that country chose human rights over national security? It's almost asking too much in this country to take on that.
Well, so I think the premise of your question is that the two are separate and distinct, and that human rights cannot be in the national security of a country. And that's really where, okay, so you are correct in terms of the kind of a cynical interpretation of history vis-a-vis the U.S. However, and this may be a generational difference, because I'm the 90s generation.
I was the 60s generation,
Right.
so I
and
can show you pictures now with
Right.
the protesters.
Right, and I think that matters a lot. So in my generation, what we were told is that, no, America is going to change, right? Human rights does matter, right? And we were indoctrinated to be the generation that would make human rights matter. We were taught that human rights mattered. In the context of an era when human rights didn't matter, right? And that America had to change, that we had to be better, and that these were mistakes made in the past that shouldn't be repeated. And that's why I said, if you're taught this in school, because I was, you were lied to. And a lot of us really believed that, and we think that Human Rights Watch is important, and we think Amnesty International is important, and we see these human rights organizations and we value them and think, no, this is they matter. Rather than, oh yeah, whatever, they're not doing it. We think the ACLU matters in the domestic level. And I mean, there are people who have studied this and question, where is human rights and ebbs and flows. But I think that is a transformation that happened. The question is the pendulum swinging the other way? And part of that education was that they weren't mutually exclusive, that it wasn't a zero sum. The way we were taught was, without human rights, you can't have national security in the long run. Right? It was about short-term versus long-term. And that with globalization, with more transnational interactions, that was even before social media, right? And before the smartphones, where now I think it's even more imperative that we're also interconnected, and we can't, if you just look at what's happening with Central America, it boggles my mind why you don't have more and more Americans, and I've heard it a little from the conservative Republicans, which I thought was odd, but I would expect the liberals to be saying this more, is what's happening in Honduras and Nicaragua, which is a major security crisis by gangs and warlords, is affecting us now. The people who are escaping that, they're escaping for their life. And they're coming here because they need safety. And these are not economic migrants. Some of them are, but a lot of them are just refugees from persecution, from violence. And for those of you who know the history of one of the reasons why we made a lot of interventions in the 80s, with the whole Sandinistas and the Iran-Contra affair and all that, we were involved and we supported the dictators, and that created this instability. And then we did something even more that fueled the fire more, is we exported or deported all these what are they called, the MS-13 gang members from our prisons, and we exported them over there, and then they set up international drug trades and international human trafficking trades with the United States with their contacts. And we thought, not our problem, we're just gonna deport them, rather than realizing, okay, we need to figure something out about this because it does come back. So it's that, I think we have to change how we think in terms of, oh, if my neighbor's house is falling apart, that's not gonna affect me. No, the fire will eventually catch your house. And maybe once upon a time that we could do that. I mean, a lot of people who are worried about the terrorism are really worried about the fact that now you can send things through people traveling and all of the trade that we do. So, I mean, I understand that I'm engaging in American exceptionalism, which is something that I critique all the time. But until we are prepared,
We're so exceptional.
right, and I don't think we're exceptional, except that we think we're exceptional.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to either decide and say, yeah, we're bad people too. And we've done a lot of really awful things. And we are not the bastion of liberty. And we are not the bastion where, this is not the place where religious freedom is protected. No, we try to, export or deport and ban Muslims. And we persecute Muslims. And accept that, and then, I guess, just live that life. Or we say, no, we do believe in these values, and we're going to do what we can to support it. And I really think the second is what most Americans would like. I'm not willing to cede. I think it's very depressing and it's really bad for the country if we say, well, that's just the way we've always been, we should accept it, and we shouldn't even try to be exceptional. I think that's a path, that's not a good path to take. But that doesn't mean that then we say we're exceptional but we're hypocrites. Yeah, I want to meet that commitment. But part of it is identifying
Well,
that
I don't
hypocrisy.
disagree with the goal of media and the fact that we would politically something that's practically could be accomplished.
Absolutely.
If you think of the current debate in the Democratic Party, human rights, it is so far removed from any kind of discussion about political discourse.
Yeah, I mean, the domestic context is civil rights, so I think it's just wanting for other people what we would want for ourselves, or at least not doing any harm. How about do no harm?
Even more personal.
Hmm?
The failure to achieve and achieve civil rights in this country.
But I think that is,
Because I was a generation which had the Voting Rights Act and whatever.
yeah, that's been
So it's just
weakened.
it's an idealistic concept, and just hard. Maybe I'm overly cynical, it's possible.
I think you have to ask yourself, what is it that makes America different?
Okay, I'm interested in something you mentioned in the beginning, where in the future, perhaps the region will become a buffer zone. And I'm thinking of this in the context of Russia's forces involved in Syria, but also the context of the Chinese investment in Ethiopia and so on. So what do you think in that context, the new American policy for the Middle East, what kind of policies would develop and like within that context? Are there any studies that have been done about that possibility?
Yeah, so one, I think the United States is being caught flat-footed. I think our political elites are not paying attention. And part of it may be because we don't have the expertise. There aren't that many people who speak Chinese fluently in the political elites. There aren't that many people who have traveled and lived in China and really understand the region. What you'll probably find, which is what happened with the Middle East, is that the Eastern European experts will suddenly become the Middle East experts, and it will suddenly become the Chinese experts. I don't know if you remember that, it was so insulting. Where all these people who were experts, they were on Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union was no longer relevant, they made a mess of things because it was completely different context, right? So I'm worried we're going to make our elites, at the government level, we're going to make a mess of our relations with China. But I don't have an answer because I'm still thinking about it, because I'm also trying to figure out Iran, because I think Iran is actually a great buffer. And I think that the U.S. is trying to take over Iran to be the buffer. I think Iran is a means to an end vis-a-vis China. Because Israel has been secured. Israel has no security problems. All of that is just propaganda. It has the strongest military, it has nuclear weapons. All of its neighbors have made peace with it officially or unofficially. So that's been resolved. It's over. I mean, it owns Jerusalem, it has the Golan Heights, it can make settlements all it wants. It won. It's done. So I think that now the strategy, because I think it was about securing Israel, controlling the oil, having the military bases in the region, which is still important vis-a-vis China, but that was vis-a-vis Soviet Union. So I think we're going to have something like a Cold War, but I don't think it will be similar because of the globalization and the interdependency, particularly along trade. And I think it's more economic and cyber than it will be kinetic. But I do think that the Middle East will become less and less important in the grand kind of strategy of the U.S., other than to be a buffer. So control it so that you can contain China. So you still want to control it, but contain China. And that requires the dictators that listen to you. And because the last thing you want are, as a democratic system, where people say, no, we want to do trade with China, or we don't want to listen to what the United States says. But right now, the people have absolutely no say in their foreign policy, and that's perfect for any hegemon, world hegemon. So I don't think there's going to be any change in terms of the U.S. defining its national security, I think wrongfully, for democracy. But again, the big question is, if things explode, right, how does that affect the United States? Will the United States say, you know what, I don't really care. You're an Atlantic Ocean away from me, you can't bring me migrants and refugees, and you'll just kill each other anyway. So what do I care? The only reason they care about national security in the region or terrorism, one, because they were killing them in Iraq, they were killing their soldiers in Iraq, and that's a problem politically here, right? They were impeding their ability to control the oil fields and to stabilize Iraq so that they could colonize it effectively, even though it's through elections, but we know who the Iraqis report to. And otherwise, whether they kill each other or not, and this was a big deal, that Daesh was starting to attack European capitals and trying to attack American capitals. They didn't care if Daesh killed other Muslims, but they definitely cared when Paris and London, and, whether it's Daesh or Al-Qaeda. That creates a really big problem because it all ties back to the domestic politics issue. The Syrian refugee crisis, I don't think the U.S. cared much about it, but boy did the Europeans care. And in 2015 they made the deal with Turkey, and they gave Turkey billions of dollars, which they actually haven't paid all of it. And Erdogan, that's why they can't touch Erdogan, because Erdogan just says, dare me to open my borders.
So he's actually released.
Has he started?
He's starting to release prisoners.
Well, that was the whole thing with the Syria issue. And so Turkey has a lot of leverage over the Europeans, and the Europeans are talking, but I don't know if Trump's listening. Because Trump's like, I got my ban, and those people are not swimming across the Atlantic Ocean, right?
They have to go to war.
Yeah, but they can't even, But Trump is much, much more worried about Central American migrants because they actually can physically get here. But he's not worried about what the refugees in the region because they're not coming here. So that's another kind of interesting national security case that has to be made, is figuring out why should the Americans, the hawkish Americans, the Machiavellian Americans, the ones who don't value these rights as a moral issue for their own souls or their own religious values or humanistic values, is why would you care for stability in the region? And one could be economic. For example, Egypt has 100 million people. That's a gigantic consumer market. And so for those who sell consumer items in Egypt, you want people buying and selling, and that's one way to look at it. But so I don't know what the answer is yet, but I would say that the graduate students in the room, this is a great area to research because it's in need of more research. And I think it's the next generation of Middle Eastern studies focus is this relationship between the Middle East and the U.S. pivot to China. We really haven't kind of interrogated that enough. And by looking at what China is doing in the Middle East, because we know that it's engaging with Africa a lot. China has been very savvy in mobilizing secretly under the radar and just expanding its reach, and the Americans are not paying attention.
The water crisis itself inspired that.
Yes.
Well, you said that the American administration would not want to see an Islamist government in Egypt.
Mhm.
So how different is the Saudi regime and many other monarchies?
The Saudi regime is not an Islamist. They're a tribe. And we know they use religion as the cover for their legitimacy, but they're not. I think Saudi Arabia is a orthodox country, or a very literalist, traditionalist country, because as we know, there was a deal that was made between the Saudi family and the Wahhabi religious leaders. And if that deal is broken, because the Saudi family has very little legitimacy on its own in a tribal society, there's multiple tribes, and if it's perceived as being heretic in a society that has become very religious, or at least identifies itself as that's part of its identity, they can't afford to. I don't think they're running the show on religion. I think it's a deal, and they're letting the religious people, the sheikhs, manage that part of society. But I don't see the Saudis as political Islamists at all. The regime, I think it's a tribe. It's a family tribe, and yes, they're Muslim, but I don't see them the same way as the Iranian government, which I think is a political Islamist government. It's Shia. I think that its policies and its politics and its worldview is defined in large part by Islam. It's very political. Muslim Brotherhood, same thing, and other strains. And there's the violent and the nonviolent. But again, it's really more about, I'm trying to think if we have an equivalent here. I think Trump is, you can't use Trump as an example, but Trump claims to be a Christian. And he's made a deal with the Christian Brotherhood, but he's not religious. So I kind of feel like the Saudi regime is the same way. I mean, I just don't see the Saudis as religious, as the regime, the royal family.
Why not the Brotherhood take control of Egypt? Why would America object?
Oh,
I mean, what would be the big deal? I mean, if the Brotherhood can work out a deal with the American administration and confirm them, tell them that they're going to establish stability and they'll be allies in one way or the other, why not Brotherhood?
well, I think that was Obama's response, because Morsi made a lot of concessions. I mean, he made a lot of mistakes too, but he made concessions to the military. He made concessions to the Israelis. He said, I'm not even going to challenge the Palestine-Israeli, or the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. He made a lot of concessions, at least at the foreign relations, except he did a couple things that, so first, there are people, there are entities who absolutely do not trust the Muslim Brotherhood. It doesn't matter what they do. They could be angels.
That's what possibly the Israeli law.
And many people in the Egyptian military who have been trained to believe that, and here as well.
And again, I mean, if the Brotherhood can, again, if they can establish a good rapport with the American administration, with the think tanks and all that, they could, bring stability and all that. I mean, what these objections?
No, I think that was Obama's reasoning, but
He didn't object.
But a lot of it has to do with perceptions and indoctrination. If you have been taught that is the devil, and even if the person doesn't look like a devil, you'll be convinced, well, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? It's a devil dressed like an angel. It doesn't matter. I mean, a lot of it was very irrational and very. The other issue was that so this is more political, and I don't think it's about the political Islamists. And this was more of a domestic issue. This is just my analysis. So I think the Muslim Brotherhood had just as much of an authoritarian tendency as the secular regimes, because they were raised in the same house with the same mode of operation. And even though they were elected democratically, it was going to take some generations to change the culture of Egypt to slowly democratize, because no one's born a Democrat. You become a Democrat, right? No one's born a dictator or in a dictatorship.
Presumably they will move in that direction.
Right, presuming they were going to move in that direction. But one of the things that they were doing, which I think was a big mistake, and was kind of made the secular dictators' fears worse, is they were acting in a tribalistic manner by putting their people, which in many ways is what most governments do anyway, but by trying to put in more loyalists in the judiciary, right? By trying to push out some of the senior military people, and it was inevitable and expected that recruitment in the military was going to no longer prohibit anyone who had Muslim Brotherhood ties, because as you know, if you're even suspected by second or third degree of having any Muslim Brotherhood connections, you're not getting into the military. He was going to change that, because of course he would. He's legitimizing the organization. The business elite were being slowly replaced. I don't know if they were replaced, but the Brotherhood's business elite were starting to play the Egyptian game of of taking, which happens whenever you have changes in political power. So all of these things were very real material threats domestically, because you're changing the order of things. And so those people, of course, they're going to fight him, even if he's Brotherhood or not. But it's easier to take him down if the people you're talking to externally have been taught and brainwashed to think that they're the devil. They think they're the devil. I mean, there are people, they really think that the Muslim Brotherhood, from start to finish, is evil, and they won't trust them no matter what. There are people in Egypt and there are people outside. So those people, it's very hard to, I think it's very hard to rationalize with them, because they're not looking at specific actions, they're imagining the worst case scenario, and then you have people on the inside. So, but if you want to ask me why the Americans, because you have a very strong, and this kind of goes back to my center over here, you have a lot of people in the United States and in Europe who are Islamophobes. They're Islamophobes, it's not a question. And it's politically correct to be an Islamophobe. And they believe in, you say the word Sharia and they think there's going to be a foreign invasion. You say Muslim and they don't care what kind of Muslim you are, whether you're conservative or not conservative. By virtue of having a Muslim identity, you're suspicious, you're a Trojan horse, you're secret, you're disloyal, and there's something genetically flawed about you. It's very racist. And this is a major constituency in the United States. I lived in Texas where the Christian Brotherhood is very powerful. And they are openly, they just believe that it's like the people اللي بيكفروا. It's the same mentality. It's exactly, no, kafir.
Now, again, I'm trying just to rephrase what you said. So the Brotherhood is going to be too strong, and America would prefer having someone who's a little bit not very secure so they can take orders a little bit easier?
Not necessarily too strong, but maybe more independent.
There you go.
Maybe more independent. But remember the US, so something I did at this presentation which was not fair is I assumed the US government is homogeneous, and it's not. I mean, I was talking at a very high level, but within the government there's a lot of disagreements. And there were people in State Department who disagreed about what to do with Morsi when he got elected and then when he got deposed. There are people in the National Security Council. So those discussions happen, which is healthy. You should have those debates. And then it's just a question of who's going to win, and then where is the public going to stand based on the information that they're fed. But I don't think that you can disconnect the anti-Muslim Brotherhood paranoia from the Islamophobia in the U.S. It's very interconnected, right? And they argued that if those people take over one of the most historically influential countries, eventually, they kept using Iran as the example. But we have no idea what was going to happen. That's the problem. Everybody's just guessing. My prediction was, and I spoke to many people when I was in Egypt in 2013, and I said, look, go protest all you want, but these guys are going to lose the parliamentary election. And when they lose the parliamentary election, Morsi's hands are going to be tied. Over time, he's going to become more and more unpopular because he's not going to be able to fix the economic problems. He overpromised, which was a fatal political mistake. And the next elections, he will be gone, and the Ikhwan will be gone. I mean, they'll be a party. It'll be like Tunisia. They'll be a political party, but they won't be influential. And eventually, Egyptian politics will evolve, and people will have to figure out how to serve the people rather than want to be, the zaim and always on television. But it was going to have to be a process. But that wasn't going to be convenient for the deep state and for the foreign parties who, for them, the easiest way to control Egypt is to have a strong man that is a one-stop shop, right? Otherwise, you have somebody who says, look, I might agree with you, but I've got a parliament, and I've got elections are coming up, and I've got, I got to deal with all these constituencies, so I can't just guarantee whatever you want. And that's a lot harder to manage. I mean, when you read a lot of Middle Eastern political history, when I was reading about Camp David, Carter and his aides had said, this has been the easiest way, it's been so easy to deal with Sadat and so difficult to deal with the Israelis. Because the Israelis had to always go back and talk to their people and talk to their cabinet but Sadat was like, yes, no. And they would ask them, well, don't you have to go? He's like, no, I make the decisions. And I remember reading that thinking, wow. But and the Israelis were driving them crazy because they had a more democratic system internally, and Begin didn't have that much power. And so it's easier. Yeah, of course, oh, great, unilateral decision.
What's your opinion about the IMF and the role and how Egypt got so many loans now from IMF,
Mhm.
and especially talking about economy and so forth. How do you see that situation?
Well, I mean, it's a part of the bigger story. It's been going on since the 70s, since the Infitah. And then Mubarak also had to do a lot of so-called reforms of the Washington Consensus in the 1990s. I don't think Egypt's unique. I think it's part of, it's the story, it's part of American foreign policy, which is the privatization and the free market economy, bringing free market economies to the rest of the world. And it's not, I mean, the democratic debates are showing the limitations of that here, with the wealth inequality and the subsidization of corporations and corporations taking over our government. I mean, we actually have a very serious democratic crisis here, where we have corporations and special interest lobbies that are governing this country through money. And our votes matter, but they're manipulated. So anyway, that's separate. So I think what they're doing there is they're just taking this system and they're saying, okay, let's just replicate it. And these people, I think, are religious zealots. These neoliberals really believe it's like a religious ideology to them. They really think this will save these countries. And I mean, Egypt had to do it. The money from Saudi Arabia was running out, UAE, and they were sending all their money to Yemen. The UAE was saying, we can't fund you forever. And actually, there was a statistic that I saw that Egypt had a major foreign currency crisis after 2012, well, after 2011. But when Sisi got the country, the foreign reserves were just going down and down and down. And that that affects your ability to borrow, that affects a lot of things. And so now I think he's brought it up to,
Is that the rating?
no, I think his reserves are, actually I don't know the exact number, if it's,
30 or 40?
no, it's something like, it actually might have gone above 30, so it was 35 billion when, or 36 billion when Mubarak was deposed, when he was kicked out. And then it went down to as low as something like 12 billion, which was really low. And I want to guess it's in the 50 billion. But the point is that the vast majority of that is foreign debt. It's not actually money based on GDP growth. So I have a statistic here that Egypt's foreign debt went from 55 billion in 2016 to 92 billion in late 2018. And so its public and foreign debt comprises 38% of its national budget. And it seems to be going up. So the IMF is lending it money. And he's got to take it because he's not able to generate the money within, and he needs the foreign reserves. But I don't think this is anything new. I mean, I don't think this is unique to Sisi or unique to post-2013. And
But the degree increased. I mean, the amount of loans increased very much relative to the national income.
yeah.
So that's...
And by the way, the U.S. plays a big role in that too. The U.S. has a lot of influence in the IMF and the World Bank, right? So that's another way that Egypt can get the U.S. to help it, is to help get those loans approved. And one of the reasons he took the subsidies away so sharply was because he couldn't get the money from the IMF without it. And he was so desperate. I mean, the country was just, it was desperate. Yes?
Fethullah Gulen is Muslim Brotherhood on steroids. Now I was wondering, is it only about Islamophobia or ideological differences within the U.S. foreign policy, or is it more than that? Like we're speaking about the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, as you're...
Because Gulen is protected,
Oh, yeah.
similarly Erdogan.
Right. So as your answer kind of implies, there is no one Muslim Brotherhood, right? And I think the sophisticated experts know that. Even if someone says, I'm Ikhwan, I'm Muslim Brotherhood, they're not the same in Egypt or Kuwait or Jordan or Syria or Saudi Arabia. And, I mean, that's why I tend to use the term political Islamist, which a lot of the conservatives use that as a derogatory term. But I don't see it as derogatory, I see it as descriptive. It just means that your Islam informs your politics in a much more direct way, right? In a much more intense way. And that's why I think we have political Christianists. We call them, evangelicals. But so the United States in the 1980s allied with Osama bin Laden, funded the Mujahideen. They knew that they were extremists. They knew they were zealots. They knew they were jihadists in the sense of willing to die for their faith. And that was very convenient for them because they would send them to die against the Soviets, right? Exactly. So I think that part of not respecting or not seeing someone as an equal or as legitimate is exploiting them. So I see, to the extent that one thinks that America is exploiting the Gulen movement to undermine Erdogan because Turkey is becoming a strong country and Erdogan is an openly political Islamist, and Israel is not happy about the rise of Turkey, and Erdogan has done what the Americans don't like and what the Europeans don't like, which is to disagree, which is to refuse to obey blindly, right? I mean, he has other issues internally because of the whole secular religious divide in the history of Turkey, but Turkish nationalism coupled with political Islam is like the Western colonial nightmare. Right? These people are not listening to us. They're not being good subjects. And that's what I think was the fear in Egypt. Is they're like, these guys eventually will become them. Because Morsi didn't hide that he looked up to Erdogan and he looked up to Turkey. I mean, that was their political platform, that it was very nationalistic and Islamist at the same time. So I don't think that, so I think part of that exploitation is kind of the other side of the coin of repression, like a direct repression. And so I think what comes to your question is, it was clear that the U.S. didn't think that they could exploit the Egyptian Ikhwan, right? They didn't see them as, oh, we can use them against a bigger enemy and we'll let them stay. I think they saw them, not necessarily Obama, but the more hawkish components, which I think were more in the Pentagon, the Department of Defense and other conservative circles. I think they saw them as quite the opposite, that they were too independent, that they wouldn't be able to control them. Although he did win. I mean, he did win the elections, and the U.S. did recognize the elections, and it didn't have to. And Obama did give him a year.
It wasn't even close.
Well, the people in Egypt think that it was a rigged.
The presidential was close. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The presidential, but that really upset a lot of people. I mean, there were people who wanted the Americans not to recognize Morsi's victory, and they didn't win that debate. So,
So I'm actually going to ask the last question and then
Okay.
thank you one. And it's a question that I think that coming from Mesa and sort of speaking from some of the students' interest, these movements we've been seeing in Lebanon, in Iraq, even in Iran, will they have any impact on, or do you think they'll have any impact on the relationship between the U.S. and Egypt that you've been talking about? I mean, will the Americans, how are they reading that when it comes to the relationship with
What
Egypt?
Sudan?
How are the Egyptians?
Sudan is even closer.
Yeah, and Sudan.
So I'm very cynical about this because of Trump. I think Trump, at least with Egypt, and possibly with other countries, but definitely with Egypt, is willing to give the green light to say, do whatever you have to do. So if they, if it's perceived as contagious, I think Trump will say, kill them if you have to kill them. And we saw that after the Muhammad Ali. I mean, they arrested 6,000 people, and who knows what's happening to them right now. Right? And then they went and re-arrested a bunch of the civil society activists like Ali Abdel Fattah, who I don't think had anything to do with these protests. And then they started arresting the lawyers who were defending people, just doing their job. And Trump is like, so I don't think that, I think Trump is the worst case scenario. He is the Machiavellian of Machiavellans. And he's very open about it. And I think Trump represents the worst of America in terms of saying, yeah, we're bullies and we're dictators and we're a hegemon and we are a zero-sum game and we will step on the weak and it's America first and whites first and Christians first. And so I think he is an awakening to a lot of the people who were raised in the 90s and maybe 2000s who believed in the American exceptionalism myth. And I think he's waking them up to, and what I worry is there's going to be a segment of the youth that are going to say, yeah, that's us. And then they will perpetuate it. But I'm hoping that there'll be more people on the other side that will go, no, that is not us. That is not us. We have to swing the pendulum the other way. But yeah, and again, it kind of goes back to what I said is, I don't think the Americans care as long as it doesn't affect their key interests. Right? So Daesh has been quashed. Al-Qaeda has been quashed. Iraq has been contained. So if there's a bunch of protests and the people kill each other, the militaries kill them, I just don't think this current administration could care less. I mean, it does not connect human rights and national security. But in contrast to some other administrations, to its credit, it tells the truth. Because I think what's problematic about some of the more moderate centrist Democrats is they lie. And that, I mean, I don't know, what do you think is worse? Would you rather just say that we're going to have a policy and we're going to name it accurately, or we're going to have a policy and we're going to misrepresent it and lie about it and hide it? And I think from a citizen's perspective and from in a democracy, I would rather see the truth. So then we can say, okay, this is what we're dealing with here. And we need to we need to mobilize around this. And we need to do something rather than be lulled into believing that everything is fine. And I just want to say, church, what is the church pikes? What's it called? The church committee hearings. Yeah, I mean, we thought that was the turning point. That was the like confessionary. That was when the U.S. said, okay, we sinned and we did all these mistakes with McCarthyism and with Vietnam. And so I think that's another reason why you're seeing like the people who grew up after that thought, oh, okay, we screwed up, but we were fixing things. But we don't have the benefit of having been around in the 60s and the 70s and kind of witnessing that. But I'm not very optimistic. I just, under this administration. It doesn't mean that they're right, by the way. I mean, it doesn't mean that it actually is good for American national interests. But the very sad part of all of this is that the only time the U.S. cares about Muslim lives or Arab lives is if their own lives are at stake. And even then, they're willing to kill their lives to save, our lives here. And that's not the angle we want to play. So.
Please join me in thanking.